"Excuse me, water is only for first-class passengers," the flight attendant said coldly, looking down at the elderly black man sitting quietly in seat 1A. He blinked in confusion, checked his ticket again, and replied softly, "But I am in first class." What she didn't know, the man she just dismissed was the father of the person who owned the entire airline, and this flight was about to change everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories that stand up for respect and fairness, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. "Excuse me, sir," the flight attendant said, her voice cold and without emotion. She stood in the aisle, arms crossed, looking down at the older black man seated in seat 1A. His name was Farouk. He had been waiting patiently, quietly pressing the call button after noticing his water glass was still empty. The attendant didn't smile or ask what he needed. Instead, she simply said, "Water service is for first-class passengers only." Farouk looked up, confused. His face was calm, but his eyes showed surprise. He wore a clean dark suit, neatly pressed, and a small gold cross hung from a chain around his neck. "I am in first class," he replied gently, pointing to the number above his seat in the boarding pass sticking out from his coat pocket. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Brenda, narrowed her eyes slightly. She glanced briefly at the seat number again, and then back at Farouk, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Let me double-check with the manifest," she said in a sharp tone, turning away without another word. The passengers around Farouk exchanged looks. A businessman named Peter sitting across the aisle smirked slightly and looked away. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman named Noreen, frowned quietly but didn't say anything. No one moved, no one spoke up. Farouk folded his hands calmly in his lap. He had been in situations like this before, treated as if he didn't belong somewhere he had every right to be. Brenda returned a few minutes later, still without water. "Sir," she began, louder this time, "please remain quiet until we sort this out. We have a lot of people to take care of." Her voice carried through the cabin, enough for others to hear. Still, there was no apology, no sign of respect. She didn't ask for his name or even glance at his ticket. Farouk gave her a small nod, not wanting to create more of a scene. He turned toward the window, letting the silence settle again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. But something inside him shifted, quietly like a door closing. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. His hands moved slowly as he typed a message to his son. "Not urgent," he wrote, "but I've been treated poorly on this flight. Just letting you know." He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he pressed send. Farouk slid the phone back into his coat pocket and leaned back in his seat. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his thoughts. The way Brenda had spoken to him wasn't new. It had happened in small ways over many years, but it still left the same bitter taste. He wasn't the type to make a fuss, and he had taught himself long ago how to keep his dignity when others tried to strip it away. In another part of the city, Farouk's son, Ammar, sat at a conference table inside a sleek office building. The message popped up on his phone, and as soon as he read it, his face changed. He didn't need many words to know what had happened. He knew his father, always respectful, never dramatic. If Farouk said he was being treated badly, it meant something had crossed a line. Ammar was calm by nature, just like his father. But unlike his father, he had a much louder kind of power. Over the last 5 years, he had built one of the most successful travel tech companies in the country. 2 months ago, his firm had quietly bought a controlling stake in a struggling airline, the same airline his father was flying on. He stood up from the table, his voice steady. "I need the crew list for Flight 407. Wheels up 30 minutes ago from Terminal C." His assistant, Ariba, blinked. "Now?" He nodded without explanation. "Now." Back on the plane, Brenda made her way through the aisle serving drinks. She handed champagne to a couple in row 1B, smiled brightly at a man with a Rolex in 2A, and ignored Farouk completely. Not once did she look in his direction. A young woman named Sana, seated across the aisle, watched the way Brenda moved. Her brow furrowed. She had noticed the earlier exchange. At first, she thought it was a misunderstanding, but now she saw it clearly. It was personal. Brenda wasn't just forgetting, she was making a point. Farouk didn't say a word. He kept his hands folded, looking out the window. He didn't want pity, but the silence from those around him felt heavy. A kind of silence that said, "We see it, but it's not our problem." Sana glanced at Farouk, then looked down, unsure whether to speak. Just then, Brenda passed by again, tray in hand, offering snacks to everyone except him. Farouk's empty tray table sat untouched, the glass still waiting. The air around him seemed colder, sharper, and though no one said a thing, everyone could feel it. Farouk's phone buzzed again. This time it was a short message from Amar. "Stay calm, I'm handling it." Farouk read the message, then placed the phone face down on the tray table. He didn't know what his son planned to do, but he trusted him. Amar had always been sharp, careful with his decisions, and fiercely protective when it came to his family, especially his father. Farouk glanced around the cabin again. The lights had dimmed slightly and passengers had settled in with headphones and pillows, drifting into the comfort of silence, all except him. Brenda returned once more to the front of the cabin. Her smile returned as she spoke with another flight attendant named Raymond, laughing softly under her breath. "He's sitting there like he owns the place," she muttered, shaking her head. Raymond gave her a tight smile but didn't reply. He had seen enough of Brenda's attitude on other flights. It wasn't new. Brenda lowered her voice. "I can always tell who belongs and who doesn't. Sometimes they sneak up here, act like they paid for the seat." She sipped from her own cup of tea, looking proud of herself. Raymond gave a small nod, but his eyes shifted toward Farouk. He didn't agree with her, but he wasn't ready to speak up either. In the cabin a few rows back, Sana was still watching. She took out her phone, opened the camera app, and took a silent photo of Farouk sitting quietly, then another of Brenda serving everyone around him. She didn't plan to post it. Not yet. But something told her this moment would matter later. Meanwhile, the plane's captain, Captain Sohail, sat in the cockpit reviewing the flight path. He heard a beep on the secure line and answered. A calm voice on the other end identified themselves as Amar's assistant. The captain straightened in his seat. "Yes, I understand. We'll be prepared," he said before ending the call. He turned to his co-pilot. "Passenger in 1A, important. Treat him with full respect from here on." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Captain Sohail didn't answer right away. He looked through the list in front of him, paused on one name, and exhaled slowly. "Let's just say someone upstairs is paying attention." In first class, Brenda walked past Farouk again, not saying a word. He didn't ask her anything. He had already asked once, and that was enough. But across the aisle, Sana leaned over slightly and whispered, "Would you like some of my water?" Farouk turned toward her, surprised. He gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I'm all right." Sana nodded. "You shouldn't be treated like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Farouk looked back out the window. "It's not the first time," he replied quietly, "but it might be the last." Back at the airline's head office, Amar stood in his private meeting room, phone in hand, voice calm but firm. "I want the operations manager to notify the ground crew at Karachi International. I'll be meeting flight 407 as soon as it lands, and have someone pull the cabin footage if needed." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone who worked with Amar knew that when he spoke this way, measured, controlled, it meant something serious was coming. Farouk, unaware of the movement happening on the ground, sat quietly in his seat, his hands resting on the tray table. Brenda hadn't returned. Neither had water. The cabin was peaceful, but the peace felt fake, like a silence pressed over something that hadn't yet erupted. A couple across the aisle, Zahid and Shazia, had been watching closely for the past hour. Zahid leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I think he's someone important." Shazia nodded. "He has a presence, doesn't he? Even in silence." Meanwhile, Brenda was back in the galley, adjusting her uniform and smoothing her hair. She glanced at herself in the mirror, satisfied with how she looked. "Some people just love playing the victim," she muttered. "They sit there, waiting for attention." Raymond stood nearby, finally unable to hold it in. "Maybe he wasn't playing anything," he said, his voice low but steady. "You ignored him the entire flight." Brenda turned, surprised. Are you taking his side now? I'm just saying, Raymond replied. What if we're wrong? Brenda scoffed and turned away. People like that always find a way to make trouble. In economy class, a teenage girl named Fizza had also noticed the tension. She leaned across the aisle and whispered to her older brother, Timur. Did you see how that lady ignored the man in 1A? She didn't even offer him water. Timur nodded, pulling out his phone. I think the guy's getting mistreated, but nobody wants to say anything. They're all too polite or too scared. He typed a quick note in his phone. Older man in 1A being ignored by crew. Looks wrong. At the front of the plane, the calm had begun to shift. The co-pilot stepped out of the cockpit and spoke briefly with Raymond. His voice was soft, but Brenda overheard. What do you mean the owner's father? She asked, blinking. The co-pilot didn't answer her directly. Just follow the service protocol, he said, and returned to the cockpit. Brenda stood frozen. Her eyes slowly shifted to seat 1A. For the first time that flight, she looked at Farouk not with superiority, but with a flicker of doubt. Brenda stared at Farouk from the galley, her thoughts suddenly restless. Her expression, once firm and confident, now began to slip. The words, the owner's father, repeated in her mind like an alarm she couldn't shut off. She replayed every moment in her head. The ignored button, the cold tone, the refusal to serve him. Her throat felt dry. Raymond noticed the shift in her face. What's the matter? He asked quietly. Brenda didn't answer. Instead, she slowly stepped out into the aisle, gripping a tray of drinks, trying to act natural. But her hands trembled slightly, and her usual smooth stride now felt hesitant. As she approached row 1, she put on the same smile she had used earlier with the other passengers. But this time, it didn't reach her eyes. Sir, she said softly, stopping beside Farouk's seat. Would you like something to drink? Water? Juice? Tea? Farouk turned his head slowly, his expression calm but unreadable. I asked for water an hour ago, he said quietly. Brenda gave a small forced laugh. Oh, I'm sorry, I must have missed that. Things got very busy. Farouk didn't reply. He just looked at her. Brenda cleared her throat. Let me bring that right away. She walked back toward the galley, but every step felt heavier. Raymond followed behind. So is it true? He asked her, voice low. Was that really the owner's father? Brenda's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't know, but if it is… She didn't finish the sentence. Back in economy, word had started to spread. Passengers who had watched the interaction now whispered in low voices. Sana looked over at the front of the plane and then at her phone. Her earlier photos now felt more important. She saved them carefully, her mind working quickly. Ammar's second message came through to Farouk's phone. They've been informed. I'll be waiting at the gate. Stay where you are. Farouk read the message and placed the phone down again. He didn't react outwardly, but something in his posture changed. The weight of the moment began to shift, not because of revenge, but because someone finally had noticed. Brenda returned minutes later with a full tray, cold water, orange juice, a premium meal upgrade, and a folded blanket. She placed everything neatly on Farouk's tray table, her smile tight, her voice softer than ever. Please let me know if you need anything else, sir. Farouk gave a polite nod. Thank you, he said just as quietly. But the tone in his voice told her that thank you wasn't a reward, it was a reminder. And Brenda knew deep down something had gone very wrong. Brenda lingered for a moment after placing the items on Farouk's tray, as if waiting for him to say something more. A smile stayed frozen on her face, but her eyes darted around, checking if others were watching. Farouk didn't look at her again. He poured himself a glass of water calmly and took a slow sip. The message was clear. He didn't need kindness born from fear. He had already seen her true face. Back in the galley, Brenda placed the empty tray on the counter and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Her heart was racing, and her mind couldn't stop running in circles. What if it really was the owner's father? What if her behavior had been seen, recorded, talked about? She had been with the airline for nearly 9 years. She had gotten away with this kind of behavior before. Subtle dismissals, icy tones, the polite refusal, but never like this. Never with someone this important. Raymond glanced at her. You should apologize properly, he said, not looking up from the cups he was stacking. I already did, she snapped. I offered him drinks, didn't I? You didn't apologize, he replied calmly. You panicked. Brenda didn't respond. She wiped her hands on a towel, then stared into the metal panel in front of her reflection blurry in its surface. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she didn't like: uncertainty. In the main cabin, Farouk had taken a few slow sips of his water. He leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds roll by outside. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected anger to look, but there was something firmer now in his silence, something that had settled in his eyes. All those years of being overlooked, questioned, challenged in subtle ways, it had built something quiet but unbreakable inside him. And today, someone had crossed the line. Passengers were now openly aware that something unusual was happening. The mood had shifted. The businessman, Peter, who had smirked earlier, was now glancing repeatedly toward the front of the cabin, his confidence replaced by unease. Zahid and Shazia whispered softly between themselves, both of them watching Brenda's sudden change in behavior. It was impossible not to notice it: her sudden sweetness, the way she now bent down when speaking, the way her voice had softened. It didn't come from sincerity, it came from fear. In economy, Timur was typing rapidly into a note on his phone. His sister Fizza leaned over to see. What are you writing? Just keeping track, he whispered. People forget what they see if they don't write it down. Sana scrolled through the photos she had taken earlier. She had decided she wouldn't post them, at least not yet, but she wanted to have them ready just in case. She had grown up seeing things like this happen, but this time, something was different. This time, the person on the receiving end had someone powerful behind him, and the flight attendant, once untouchable, was now clearly shaken. Brenda returned once more to Farouk's row. This time she wasn't carrying a tray. She crouched slightly to be closer to his eye level, her voice gentle and uncertain. Sir, she said, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. I misunderstood, and I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome. Farouk looked at her carefully. His face remained calm, but his eyes were steady. Miss, he replied quietly, you didn't misunderstand. You made a decision. Brenda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She stood up slowly, gave a faint nod, and walked away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could feel the weight of the passenger's eyes on her as she passed. Back in his seat, Farouk looked down at his phone again. A third message had arrived. 10 minutes until landing. I'll be waiting at the gate. Farouk smiled slightly to himself, not with pride or triumph, but with the quiet peace of a man who knew that justice didn't always have to be loud, it just had to arrive. As the plane began its slow descent, the hum of the engines shifted, and the overhead lights flickered slightly. Passengers stirred from their naps, adjusted seat belts, and stowed away half-empty cups and earbuds. But in seat 1A, Farouk remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest, his gaze fixed out the window. The sun had started to set, casting a golden glow across the clouds. From a distance, everything looked peaceful, serene, but inside the cabin, tension wrapped around the air like a wire pulled tight. Brenda stood in the galley pretending to reorganize items, but her eyes kept flicking toward the front. Every now and then, she peeked toward Farouk, but he never looked back. That silence from him, it was louder than any complaint she'd ever heard. Raymond approached her slowly, lowering his voice. What exactly did you say to him earlier? Brenda hesitated. I didn't say anything wrong. I just made a mistake. You said he didn't belong in first class, Raymond reminded her. Twice, in front of everyone. I didn't know who he was, she whispered, her voice sharp but shaky. That's not the point, he replied. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect. Brenda didn't answer. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts tangled. Her hands had started sweating, and she wiped them again and again on the edge of her uniform. She had never been this nervous before, not in her entire flying career. This wasn't just about an angry passenger or a bad review. This was something else, something bigger. Back in economy, Sana had quietly told her seatmate what was happening. Word spread quickly. Passengers leaned over to whisper, passed notes on phone screens, exchanged glances. The man in 1A wasn't just any man. He was the father of the airline's owner, and he had been mistreated in front of a cabin full of silent witnesses. Ty Moore, still observing from his seat, muttered under his breath, "She's going to lose her job." Fizza looked worried. "Do you think she deserves to?" Ty Moore shrugged. "I don't know, but she's been doing this to people for years. She just chose the wrong one today." As the wheels lowered and the captain announced the final descent, the cabin crew moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and tray tables. Brenda approached Farouk one last time, her voice tight and careful. "We'll be landing shortly, sir. Is there anything I can assist you with before arrival?" Farouk looked at her calmly. "No, thank you," he replied. "I believe I'll be well taken care of after landing." The way he said it, it didn't sound like a threat. It wasn't cruel, but it carried weight, enough to make Brenda's heart drop just a little further in her chest. Brenda turned away slowly, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She could feel eyes on her, passengers watching her every step. For the first time, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Farouk leaned back in his seat, the plane beginning its slow glide toward the runway. His mind was calm. He had said nothing to the crew. He had raised no voice, filed no complaint. All he had done was wait. Wait for the plane to land. Wait for truth to walk through the cabin door and speak without needing permission. The flight touched down with a gentle bump, and the brakes hummed as the aircraft slowed along the runway. Passengers clapped politely, but the sound was scattered and awkward, like they weren't sure what tone to keep. Something unspoken was about to happen, and everyone knew it. Out the window, Farouk saw it before anyone else. A black SUV, sleek and still, parked just beside the arrival gate. The rear door opened. A familiar figure stepped out. Ammar. He stood tall in a gray coat, hands in his pockets, face calm. Behind him were two uniformed staff from the airline's executive team. They didn't look rushed, they looked ready. Farouk smiled faintly just for a second. He reached for his walking cane, stood slowly as the plane came to a stop, and waited at the front of the cabin as instructed. Brenda stood nearby, pale and stiff, pretending to organize her papers. She didn't speak. The cabin door opened, and silence fell. As the door opened, warm air from the jet bridge swept into the cabin, carrying with it a kind of quiet that felt heavier than the sound of engines ever could. Passengers paused, still in their seats, their eyes shifting forward. The usual rush to grab bags and line up to leave didn't happen. For once, no one wanted to move too soon. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Ammar stepped in calmly. He wasn't a man who made noise when he entered a room. He didn't need to. His presence carried something sharper than volume. Certainty. Authority without effort. His coat was buttoned neatly, his face unreadable, and he didn't glance around the cabin. His eyes went straight to seat 1A. Farouk was already standing. He didn't look emotional or proud, just steady. Their eyes met, and Ammar gave a slight nod. No hug, no words yet, just acknowledgement, the kind only a father and son who understood each other deeply could exchange. Behind Ammar, the two executives followed closely, both wearing the same tight expressions. They knew the weight of what was coming. Brenda, still holding her tablet in both hands, suddenly felt like it weighed more than she could carry. Her palms were damp, her mouth dry. She tried to stand straighter but couldn't quite manage it. Ammar turned his gaze slowly toward her. "Who was responsible for first-class service on this flight?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. Brenda's lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat had closed. Raymond stepped forward quietly. "That would be Brenda, sir." Ammar didn't even blink. "Thank you," he said without looking at Raymond. He took a few small steps forward, now standing just feet from Brenda. "I received 3 messages from my father during this flight," he said, his tone measured. "Not once did he raise his voice. Not once did he ask me to intervene. But he didn't need to. The moment he said he was being ignored, I already knew what was happening." Brenda opened her mouth. "Sir, I didn't know." Ammar raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop her. "You didn't know who he was. I understand that. But it shouldn't take knowing someone's last name to offer them a glass of water." He turned slightly, now addressing the entire cabin. "This airline was built by a man who believed in quiet dignity, A man who spent his life treating janitors and CEOs the same way. That man, he said, gesturing to Farouk, is not just my father. He is the reason this company even exists. Passengers listened in absolute silence. Many lowered their heads. Some glanced at Farouk, visibly ashamed of their own earlier silence. Amr's voice remained even. We don't run this airline to sell luxury. We run it to show what respect looks like, from the front row to the back. Brenda's eyes filled with moisture. She had no words left, just regret and fear. I didn't mean, she started again, her voice cracking. Amr looked directly at her. Intentions don't excuse patterns. You didn't just make a mistake. You exposed a habit. One of the executives stepped forward and quietly said, Miss Brenda, please gather your things. You'll be escorted off the aircraft and suspended until further review. Gasps whispered through the cabin. Brenda stood frozen. Her hands trembled. She looked at Farouk, hoping for mercy. A nod, a gesture, something. But he only gave her a soft glance. Calm, neutral, no hate, just finality. Brenda slowly turned, walked down the aisle past the staring passengers, and disappeared behind the curtain toward the rear of the plane. Amr looked at Raymond and gave a small nod. Thank you for your professionalism, he said. Raymond nodded back, clearly uncomfortable but quietly relieved. Amr turned to his father. Ready to go? Farouk gave a small nod, resting one hand lightly on Amr's arm. The two walked together down the narrow aisle as passengers parted, allowing them through like a path clearing for something sacred. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered, but everyone watched, because respect had just walked off the plane, quietly, with its head held high. As Farouk and Amr stepped out of the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, the cabin behind them remained silent. The door closed slowly, as if the air itself hesitated to move on from what had just happened. Passengers still hadn't left their seats. Some stared ahead, others looked down, their minds caught in the weight of the moment. A few glanced toward the spot where Brenda had stood just minutes ago, where her confidence had shattered without a single word of anger from the man she dismissed. Outside, the airport ground crew stood near the gate with a mix of confusion and curiosity. They weren't used to executives greeting flights personally, let alone accompanied by the airline owner's father. Amr nodded briefly to the staff, and they stepped aside with respect. The black SUV that had been waiting earlier now stood ready at the base of the staircase. Farouk walked with slow steps, using his cane lightly. He didn't speak right away. His eyes were steady, his shoulders relaxed, but there was something in his silence that spoke louder than any words. Amr walked beside him, matching his pace, glancing at his father from time to time. You didn't have to come, Farouk said finally, his voice low but firm. I did, Amr replied, not looking away. You wouldn't have asked, but I wasn't going to let it pass. Farouk gave a small nod. That's not how I raised you, to use your power for revenge. This wasn't revenge, Amr said softly. This was correction. They reached the vehicle, and a staff member opened the rear door. Farouk paused before getting in and looked back toward the plane one last time. There was no pride in his face, just peace. He climbed into the car, followed by his son. Inside the cabin, the tension had begun to ease. People finally started to move, slowly retrieving bags, murmuring among themselves. Noreen, the woman who had watched everything from across the aisle, whispered to the person beside her, I'll never forget that. Zahid shook his head, still stunned. I thought he was just a quiet old man. I didn't know. Shazia cut in, gently. Does it matter who he was? He didn't deserve that, either way. Raymond finished tidying up, still thinking about Farouk's words, about dignity, about habits, about the difference between politeness and respect. He looked at the empty seat in 1A, its blanket still folded, the glass now full. Sana, meanwhile, had just posted something on her social media. Not a photo, not the story, just a short message. Some people carry power in silence, and when it speaks, it doesn't need to raise its voice. Farouk and Amr's SUV pulled away from the gate quietly, leaving behind the noise of engines and announcements, carrying two men who hadn't needed to shout to change something inside that cabin. something more lasting than just a policy or an apology. At the terminal entrance, journalists had already caught wind of something unusual. One reporter rushed forward with a camera, but Amar raised a hand. "No comments," he said simply. Farouk looked at him as they entered the building. "So what happens now?" "I'll handle it," Amar said. "There's going to be a meeting. Some policies will change. Some people will need to answer questions. But more importantly," he paused, then looked at his father, "people will remember this flight for a long time." Farouk nodded once, slowly. "Let's just hope they remember the right part." The following morning, the story had already begun to take shape beyond the walls of the aircraft. It started as whispers, passengers sending texts to friends, a few quiet posts online, and subtle mentions on travel blogs. But by midday, the airline's name was trending across several platforms. People weren't talking about points, legroom, or flight delays. They were talking about respect, silence, and how power, when held by the right hands, could speak with restraint. Inside the airline's headquarters, a special meeting had been called. Department heads, senior crew managers, HR leads, and executive staff filled the glass conference room with nervous energy. No one knew exactly what Amar planned to say, but they understood it wasn't going to be a routine debrief. Amar entered the room quietly, just as he had stepped onto the aircraft the day before. This time he carried a thin folder in his hand. He placed it on the table, looked around the room, and began without pleasantries. "My father flew on one of our planes yesterday," he said, voice even. "You all know that. You've seen the messages, the reactions, the fallout. What many of you may not realize is that he didn't tell anyone who he was. He boarded like any other passenger. No special notes in the system, no alerts, no expectation of attention." He looked around the room, pausing briefly. "And yet," he continued, "he was treated differently. Not because of his name, not because of his status, but because of something else entirely. Because of the assumptions someone made based on how he looked. And that's not something we fix with an apology." The room was silent. Some staff looked down. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "What happened yesterday wasn't just a bad customer experience," Amar went on. "It exposed a weakness in our culture, a habit of judgment, a belief, whether conscious or not, that you can decide who deserves to be treated with dignity." He picked up the folder and opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "This is a list of every customer service complaint received in the last 2 years related to staff behavior. Specifically cases where passengers reported being ignored, dismissed, or spoken to unprofessionally." He let that sit for a moment. "Brenda's name appears 12 times. There was a quiet intake of breath across the room. She was warned, retrained, and kept on board. And yesterday, she made the same mistake again. But this time, the person she humiliated had a louder voice." Amar placed the paper back into the folder and closed it gently. "I don't care about public embarrassment," he said. "This is not about headlines or social media. This is about who we are when no one's watching. It's about the people we let speak for us every day. Our crew, our attendants, our front lines. Because they're not just serving drinks, they're showing passengers what our values really look like in practice." He paused again. No one spoke. "Starting today," he said, "every employee will go through a new training program. It's not just about inclusion, it's about decency, accountability, listening, and it's mandatory, no matter your position." He picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm. "And as for Brenda, she's no longer with the airline. That decision wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. She didn't just ignore a passenger. She ignored a pattern she refused to change." Amar took one last look around the room. This company was built by a man who never needed to raise his voice to teach a lesson. Let's try to live up to that. He left the room without waiting for applause or approval. That wasn't why he came. Outside the conference hall, his assistant Ariba walked beside him. "Should we prepare a press statement?" Amar shook his head. "Not yet. Let the story tell itself. People will believe what they saw on that flight more than anything we write on a website." He stopped for a moment before entering his office. "What matters now is how we treat the next person who boards our plane, the one no one knows. That's who we're answering to." Inside his office, the phone buzzed softly. It was a message from Farouk. You spoke well, but real change doesn't start in meetings, it starts in habits. Amr smiled faintly, and he knew his father was right. 2 weeks had passed since the flight, but the memory of it lingered like a mark across every hallway of the airline. The story had slowly found its way into the hands of journalists, bloggers, and frequent flyers. Not because Amar had promoted it, he had made no statement to the press, refused interviews, and declined every invitation to speak publicly. But stories like this had a life of their own. It was the passengers who had carried it forward. Sana, the young woman from the flight, had written a long post on her blog titled, "The Man in 1A." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even angry. It was observant, thoughtful. She wrote about how she watched a man be ignored, how she saw others stay silent, and how, in the end, without raising his voice or demanding attention, he changed the entire room just by existing with dignity. Her post was shared over 10,000 times within the first week. Timur's simple note, originally meant for his own memory, had become a thread on social media. Flight 407, How Silence Revealed the Loudest Truth. It included a timeline of events, with one photo at the end, the empty seat in 1A, blanket still folded, untouched meal, and a full glass of water sitting neatly at the center of the tray. That photo alone was reposted by several major news accounts. Even Brenda's name had surfaced, though Amar's team made no effort to humiliate her. Her dismissal was quiet and professional. Still, someone on the crew had spoken to a reporter anonymously, and soon her behavior wasn't just an internal matter anymore. Comments filled the online spaces, some harsh, some fair, many reflective. But while the world reacted, Farouk remained where he always did, away from the noise. He didn't do interviews. He didn't respond to requests. He returned to his small home just outside the city, where he kept a modest garden, met with people from his local community, and went about his life without fanfare. When neighbors asked about the flight, he only smiled gently and said, "It taught people something. That's enough." Yet something in him had shifted, even if he didn't say it out loud. One afternoon, he received a letter. Not a printed memo or typed apology, a handwritten letter, placed in a cream envelope with no stamp. It had come from Brenda. She wrote with shaky handwriting, words carefully chosen. She admitted her mistakes, not just from the flight, but from years of holding assumptions she never questioned. She wrote about how her pride had blinded her, how being dismissed herself opened her eyes to what it felt like, and how, after her suspension turned into permanent dismissal, she'd been forced to reflect on who she had become. "I was ashamed," she wrote, "not because I got caught, but because I finally saw myself the way others did, and I didn't like what I saw." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg for her job. She only hoped that if they ever met again, he might see that she had changed. Farouk folded the letter quietly and placed it inside a small drawer in his bookshelf. He didn't tell anyone about it, not even Amar. Elsewhere, the airline had begun changing, slowly but noticeably. Cabin crew went through a new training system designed not by a consultant, but with Farouk's story as the foundation. They read the blog post. They discussed the photo of seat 1A. They heard from other passengers, many of whom came forward to share moments when they too had been made to feel out of place, not just on flights, but in everyday spaces. Raymond was invited to speak at the first session. He wasn't comfortable with microphones or presentations, but he stood in front of a room of 30 crew members and spoke plainly. "I stood there," he said, "and I saw it happening, and I didn't stop it. I thought staying neutral made me professional, but now I realize silence helps the wrong side too." His words stayed with the new crew. Several of them later said it was the most honest thing they'd heard during training. Passengers noticed the change too. Small things at first, greetings that felt more genuine, attention given more evenly, eyes that didn't skim past them when they boarded. The culture that once tolerated small acts of disregard was now being rebuilt, quietly from within. Amar didn't put up signs about it. There were no billboards or campaigns. The proof was in the habits, in how the crew served water, in who they looked at first, in how they responded to the quiet people in seat 1A. Farouk, sitting at his kitchen table one morning, read through a letter from a young flight attendant. Her name was Ramin. She had been part of the new training. She wrote, "I used to think people would tell you if you were treating them badly, But now I know the people who deserve the most respect are often the quietest in the room. Thank you for teaching me that, without ever raising your voice. Farouk smiled gently, folded the letter, and looked out the window at his garden. The flowers had just begun to bloom. Another month passed, and what began as an uncomfortable incident on Flight 407 had matured into something far more meaningful across the airline and beyond. Stories continued to emerge. Passengers from other flights began sharing small, forgotten memories that now carried new weight. A mother wrote about how a flight attendant once ignored her elderly father when he asked for a blanket, assuming he was confused about the class he was seated in. A student recalled how her polite request for help with a tray was met with a sigh and silence. Most of these moments had gone unnoticed until Farouk's quiet resistance gave them voice. But while the airline moved forward, training programs expanding, internal evaluations being restructured, senior staff reshuffled, Ammar still felt unsettled. There was progress, yes, and his leadership had been praised. But something still pulled at him, something unfinished. He realized it one evening while reviewing passenger feedback. A report had been filed that very day. Not a complaint, not a compliment, just a quiet thank you note from a passenger named Khadija, who had flown the same route as Farouk, but weeks later. I was helped onto the plane before I could even ask, it read. No one stared at my walking cane. No one questioned my seat. They treated me like I belonged, without hesitation. I don't know what changed, but I felt it. That line stuck with him. I don't know what changed, but I felt it. Amr closed his laptop and stood by the window of his office. Outside, the city blinked softly. Lights scattered across glass towers and quiet streets. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then dialed. The call went to voicemail. He left a message. Baba, I think we should fly together again. Same route. No announcement. Just you and me this time. 2 weeks later, the booking was made. No special note, no alert to the crew, no first-name favors. They boarded quietly side by side, Ammar in a light sweater, Farouk in his usual dark coat. The crew greeted them with warm smiles, polite and measured. Nothing too extra, but nothing missing either. Farouk sat by the window in 2A this time, and when the call light blinked once, it was answered within 30 seconds. Would you like some water, sir? Asked the young attendant, a woman named Samiha. Farouk looked up, surprised by the genuine tone. Yes, please, he said. She returned with a chilled glass, 2 slices of lemon on the side. Let me know if you'd like anything else, she added. Then she smiled, not the kind forced by protocol, but the kind that met the eyes and stayed for a second longer. Ammar, watching from across the aisle, said nothing. He just offered his father a knowing look. As the plane climbed into the soft blue sky, Farouk relaxed into his seat. The meal came on time. The attendant stopped by to ask if he was comfortable. And at one point, as he walked down the aisle for a stretch, a young man with earbuds stepped aside and said, You're the one from the story, aren't you? Farouk smiled gently. Only if it was a good one. The young man grinned and nodded. It was. The rest of the flight passed in quiet peace. No incidents, no tension. Only a strange calm that felt earned rather than expected. Upon landing, Ammar and Farouk exited last. As they stepped into the terminal, Farouk paused for a moment, watching the flow of passengers ahead of him. People moved quickly, dragging suitcases, hugging loved ones, reading signs. No one noticed them, and for once that anonymity felt right. He turned to his son. You know, he said, sometimes the best change isn't the kind people notice. It's the kind they stop having to notice at all. Ammar nodded. That's what we're aiming for. They walked together through the quiet terminal, not as a headline, not as a lesson, but simply as passengers who had taken a flight and been treated with respect. No special treatment, no spotlight, just dignity, freely given, and finally normal. The flight behind them faded into the schedule board as another routine journey. But for the airline, and for those who now served with different eyes, it would never be just routine again. Weeks turned into months, and what had once been a viral incident became something deeper. A quiet ripple in the foundation of how people were treated, not just in the sky, but in everyday life. The story of the man in 1A had slowly begun fading from headlines, as all stories eventually do. But its real impact never relied on the noise. It lived in the small, nearly invisible changes. At the airline, the effects continued to unfold behind the scenes. A new system of anonymous reporting had been launched, allowing passengers and employees to share experiences, both good and bad, without fear of consequence. Within the first 30 days, dozens of crew members sent in reflections about moments they wished they'd handled differently. Some apologized for things they had said months ago. Others simply admitted they had learned something about themselves. One note stood out. It came from a crew member who had never met Farouk, but had read everything about the flight and its aftermath. I used to think professionalism was enough, it said. Smile, serve, move on. But I've learned it's not about being polite. It's about being present, seeing people as people. I've changed the way I move down the aisle now. Slower, eyes up. I greet every passenger like they belong, because they do. Amr kept a printed copy of that letter in his office drawer. Not because he needed praise, but because it reminded him that real culture isn't built with speeches. It's built with small daily choices. Meanwhile, Farouk went about his life as he always had. He still walked to the same small masjid every morning, still shopped at the neighborhood store where the shopkeeper had known him for over 20 years. He didn't speak of the flight anymore, not even when people tried to bring it up. One day, a young man approached him after prayers. "Sir," he said, a little nervous, "I saw the video someone posted online. The one from that flight. I just wanted to say, thank you." "For what?" Farouk asked gently, tilting his head. "For showing us what patience looks like," the young man replied. "You didn't have to stay quiet, but you did, and somehow, that made it louder." Farouk placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "There's a difference between staying silent and standing still. I wasn't silent. I was steady. That's something my father taught me." At home, Farouk opened a small wooden box he kept in the corner of his bookshelf. Inside were a few handwritten letters, some thank you notes, and the folded apology Brenda had sent months earlier. He had never written back. He didn't believe in reacting out of obligation. But that evening, something made him reach for a pen. He didn't write much, just a short message in neat handwriting. "I forgive you. I hope you forgive yourself." That's the harder part. He placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and left it at his doorstep the next morning, where Amar's driver often stopped by. Whether it reached her or not didn't matter. What mattered was that the act had left his hands. In the months that followed, Brenda did receive the letter. She had started working with a nonprofit that offered empathy and sensitivity training to public service workers. She didn't mention her past, but she worked harder than anyone in the room. When she read Farouk's message, she sat in silence for nearly an hour. Then she folded the letter and placed it in her wallet. Meanwhile, the airline, once known for its aggressive focus on luxury and elite service, slowly earned a new reputation. Not for its meals, not for its seats, but for how its people behaved. Reviews began appearing on travel sites, not about upgrades or pricing, but about how the staff treated every passenger like they mattered, no matter where they sat. Passengers began noticing the little things again. A flight attendant remembering someone's name, helping a child with a bag, offering a second blanket before being asked. These weren't policy changes. They were cultural corrections, built on quiet influence. One day at a small press event, a reporter asked Amar what inspired the shift. He replied with a simple sentence. "My father reminded us how much power there is in not being cruel." No slogans, no press releases, just truth. The reporter pressed further. "Wasn't it difficult to change such a large company based on one incident?" Amar shook his head slightly. "It wasn't based on one incident. That flight was just a mirror. What we saw reflected in it, that's what had to change." That answer went viral on its own. But once again, Amr didn't try to follow the noise. He called his father that evening, and they spoke about the weather, the garden, and a new book Farouk had been reading. Not once did they mention the flight, or the stories, or the praise. Because when change becomes real, it doesn't need to be repeated. It simply continues. As the new year approached, the airline quietly rolled out a new training program titled Presence Before Policy. It didn't come with flashy brochures or advertising campaigns. It was implemented quietly, with small group workshops led by trainers who had spent time with passengers, not just policy binders. The curriculum was simple. Listen, observe, do not assume, Treat people like people, not profiles. Farouk's story wasn't directly named in the material, but it lived between every line. His photo, taken candidly during that return flight beside Ammar, hung in a few of the internal lounges used for employee breaks. Not as a celebrity, not even with a name beneath it. Just an image of an elderly man in a dark coat, sitting peacefully by the window, hands folded on his lap, looking out at the sky. Every now and then, someone new would ask, "Who's that?" And another would respond, "That's the man who reminded this airline what respect looks like." Farouk didn't know about the photo. He didn't need to. He had returned fully to the life he loved, small, quiet, and deeply rooted in community. His days began with early morning prayers and ended with handwritten notes in the margins of books he'd read dozens of times. He still met young people at the local center who came to seek advice. Not because he gave lectures, but because he listened more than most. At one of those gatherings, a college student named Zoya asked him, "How did you stay calm when they treated you that way on the plane? Didn't you want to speak up? To defend yourself?" Farouk thought for a moment before replying, "When someone tries to lower your worth, don't hand them your dignity. Hold it. Let them see you carry it well. That teaches more than words ever could." Zoya nodded slowly, writing the words down in her notebook. Farouk looked at her and smiled. "But don't stay quiet out of fear. Stay calm out of strength. That's different." Back at the airline, small things continued to shift. A flight attendant named Saqib had just completed the new training program. He stood in the galley of a late-night flight, looking around the cabin as passengers began to board. A man with worn shoes and a heavy coat stepped into first class. Saqib's first thought was that he had entered the wrong section, but he paused, took a breath, walked forward and said, "Good evening, sir. May I help you with your bag?" The man nodded and showed his first-class ticket. Saqib smiled and said, "You're in the right place. Let me get that for you." He never would have hesitated a year ago, but today he paused long enough to remember. On a different route, a woman named Mahira, who had served on flights for 10 years, found herself listening more closely when an elderly passenger asked a second time for a blanket. Normally she might have brushed it off. Busy shift, lots to do. But she stopped, crouched down, and asked, "Are you feeling cold or is it something else?" The man smiled faintly and said, "My wife used to travel with me. I get lonely now. The blanket just helps me feel like someone's still with me." Mahira brought him too, and stayed for a moment longer. Passengers began noticing, not in bold, dramatic ways, but in small touches that made them feel more human again. Letters to the airline shifted in tone. Reviews, once filled with complaints about baggage delays or meal portions, now carried stories of kindness. The steward remembered my name. She noticed I was nervous and checked on me 3 times. He offered water before I even asked. Ammar received a folder every Friday containing a collection of such feedback. He didn't always have time to read them all, but one caught his eye on a quiet afternoon. "I've been flying for 40 years, it began, and for the first time, I felt seen. Not served, not smiled at, but seen. That changes everything." He closed the letter and leaned back in his chair, remembering that night when he boarded Flight 407, the stillness in his father's face, the uneasiness in the air, the moment Brenda realized who she had ignored. Ammar didn't regret how he handled it, but he knew that what mattered wasn't how people were punished, but how people changed. And that part was unfolding now, slowly, through others. That evening, he visited Farouk. They sat on the veranda as the sun dipped behind the trees, the air crisp, quiet. "I've been thinking," Ammar said, "about how we remember moments. That flight, it changed so much. But to you, it seems like it was just another day." Farouk chuckled gently. "That's because it was. People think change comes from big moments, but it actually comes from many small ones. When people remember to pause, look, and act differently." "Do you ever wish you had responded more directly?" Ammar asked. "Spoken up?" Farouk shook his head slowly. "If I had shouted, people would have forgotten it in a day. But now, months later, they're still changing. Because I stayed seated." Ammar smiled, looked at the stars beginning to emerge. "You think it's enough?" Farouk placed his hand on his son's arm. It's not about enough. It's about direction. As long as we're facing the right way, even slow steps move us forward. The night settled around them, quiet and full. And in that stillness, something felt complete. Not finished, but right. Spring arrived with quiet steps. Buds appeared on Farouk's garden vines. The breeze carried a softer warmth, and the sky seemed a little brighter each morning. Life moved forward, gently and without fuss. But beneath the quiet rhythm of days, a sense of transformation lingered. Not loud, not flashing in headlines, but present like roots growing beneath the soil. The airline had officially completed the first full cycle of its new culture training. Over 90% of the cabin crew had participated, and senior leadership began introducing accountability check-ins. Short reflections after each flight, where staff shared something they'd learned, noticed, or regretted. The point wasn't control, it was awareness. And over time, that awareness was becoming habit. At a leadership summit, Amr was invited to speak about the company's evolution. Standing at the front of a modest hall filled with business professionals, partners, and employees, he wore no suit, gave no slideshow. He just stood with hands in his pockets and shared a story. There was a flight, he said, where a man was denied a glass of water. He didn't shout, he didn't demand. But his silence made people listen in a way noise never could. That man was my father. He paused. What followed wasn't a scandal. It was a mirror, and we didn't like what we saw. He went on to describe how the real work didn't begin with apologies. It began with questions, with discomfort, with reflection, and slowly with change. Respect, he said, should never be something we earn through recognition. It should be the starting point, not the reward. When he finished, no one clapped right away. Not because they were unmoved, but because the truth had sunk in too deeply to respond with noise. The applause came after a breath, thoughtful, earnest, not for him, but for what the company had become. Outside the walls of the airline, the story had settled into public memory not as a trending moment, but as a quiet example people referred to when speaking of leadership, humility, or how to handle conflict without revenge. Educators used it in ethics classes. Some spiritual leaders spoke about it in Friday sermons and Sunday homilies. Not naming names, just retelling the shape of it. A man seated in first class, treated as if he didn't belong, who never raised his voice, and yet changed everything. Meanwhile, Farouk continued living his life with the same simplicity. He never once referred to himself as the man from the flight. When people brought it up, he smiled politely and redirected the conversation toward them. He asked about their families, their work, their hopes. He still believed listening was the rarest form of respect. One afternoon, a special envelope arrived at his home. It was hand-delivered, without postage, sealed with the airline's new crest. Inside, a single ticket. It was first class. A note was clipped to it, written in Amar's hand. No public event, no news, no statements. Just one more flight, Baba, with the crew that trained under your example. This time, not as a passenger, but as a guest of honor. Farouk chuckled under his breath. He tucked the ticket into his drawer and decided to think about it. Not because he needed the trip, but because he appreciated the gesture. Dignity, after all, wasn't about who offered it. It was about whether it was offered freely. The day of the flight arrived weeks later. Farouk wore the same coat he had worn that first time. Not out of symbolism, but out of habit. The driver greeted him warmly, and as he entered the airport, people didn't rush toward him with cameras or interviews. They simply nodded, stepped aside, and smiled. At the gate, the same young attendant who had once served him on his return flight, Samiha, stood waiting. She greeted him with the kind of respect that didn't need instruction. "We've been looking forward to this, sir," she said. "Everything is ready." On board, the seat had been prepared with a small card on the tray table. It read, "Seat 1A, reserved for the man who reminded us what leadership really looks like." Farouk sat quietly. The crew moved gently around him, respectful but not excessive. He noticed the difference. They weren't serving him because of his title or what had happened before. They were simply present, aware, kind. As the plane ascended into the soft afternoon sky, Farouk closed his eyes and let the silence fill his mind. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of peace. Amar, seated beside him, looked over. "You all right?" Farouk nodded. "They're doing well," he said. "They're listening now." And that, more than anything, was enough. The sky stretched out ahead of them. No turbulence, no tension. Just a flight that felt the way every journey should. Equal, respectful, calm. Not because someone demanded change, but because someone had the courage to sit still until change arrived on its own. If this story touched you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.